Good afternoon. My name is Derek Allridge, and I am a professor in the Curry School of Education and Human Development, where I also serve as the director of the Center for Race and Public Education in the South and director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us for our first installment of the Teachers in the Movement webinar series. This series was born as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In an effort to both continue our work and engage with friends and supporters, Teachers in the Movement Project team decided to host a webinar series which would provide audiences the opportunity to join the team in viewing and discussing some of our most notable interviews. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Teachers in the Movement, the project was born in 2014 when a group of students and I at UVA decided to collect the narratives of teachers involved in civil rights. Over the past 6 years, our team has grown and has finally tuned our vision to interview teachers and educators who taught during the civil rights movement between 1950 through the 1970s. And we are focusing on teachers who espouse ideals of equality, democracy, self-determination, and freedom through their pedagogy. To date, the team has conducted several hundred interviews with educators in 5 states: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Contrary to the idea among some scholars that teachers were not actively involved in the civil rights movement, our project operates from the premise that teachers played an integral role in the movement. For example, not only as members of civil rights organizations like the NAACP, but also as teachers in the classroom. Drawing on Professor Tondra Loder Jackson's notion of intellectual activism, we primarily focus on unknown teacher activists of the movement who don't appear in history textbooks. However, every so often we interview someone of national stature and prominence, someone who does appear in textbooks, scholarly works, and documentaries of the movement. One such individual was Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker. Allow me to provide a little background information about Dr. Walker. He was born in Brockton, Massachusetts, in 1929. He has a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemistry and Physics in 1950, and a Master of Divinity degree in 1953 from Virginia Union University. In 1975, he received his doctorate in Black Church Studies from Colgate Rochester Divinity School. He married Teresa Ann Walker, a prominent educator and activist in her own right. He served as a pastor for Guilford Baptist Church in Petersburg. He was a president of the NAACP in Petersburg, and he founded the Petersburg Improvement Association also in 1953. He served as the state director of the Congress for Racial Equality and became the executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the early 1960s from 1961 to 64. He served as Martin Luther King's chief of staff, and he was known throughout the movement as a skillful tactician and strategist. In 1967, he became the pastor of Canaan Baptist Church in Harlem, where he served for 37 years. And he's the author of many books and essays on the history of the Black church, Black church music, as well as Black theology. In 2015, members of the Teachers in the Movement Project interviewed Dr. Walker in Chester, Virginia. Today, we are fortunate to have each of the interviewers discuss their interview with the civil rights icon. So let me turn it over now to the team of researchers who worked with me on that project and let them introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Lindsay Jones. I am a historian of African American education, where I was trained by Dr. Allridge at the Curry School of Education, where I was a graduate research assistant with Teachers in the Movement and was fortunate enough to participate in the interview that we're talking about this afternoon. I'm currently based in Providence, Rhode Island, where I am a Presidential Diversity Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Education at Brown University. I'm currently working on a book manuscript examining the efforts of organized Black women in the state of Virginia to protect and educate Black girls who were labeled juvenile delinquents between the years of 1915 and 1940.
Greetings. My name is Carmen Foster. I serve as a research associate and consultant also for Teachers in the Movement. My research has focused on school desegregation in Richmond, Virginia in the early 1960s. I have a personal interest in this topic because I was one of the first wave of students in the early 1960s to desegregate the Richmond public schools. I also am a former student of Professor Aldridge at the University of Virginia. Currently, I also serve as an adjunct faculty at the Federal Executive Institute in Charlottesville, and I have an encore career as a leadership development facilitator and an executive coach. And as a practitioner, I focus on the uses of history and the frameworks of adaptive leadership to lead change. I'm glad to be here.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Danielle Wingfield Smith. I am a postdoctoral scholar with the Center for Race and Public Education in the South at the Curry School at UVA, and also the Associate Director of the Teachers in the Movement Project. My work centers on the role of Henry Marsh, the first Black mayor of Richmond, Virginia, in desegregating schools in Virginia. I pull from both a historical and legal perspective as both a lawyer and historian, and I'm excited to be here with you all today.
Good afternoon. My name is Alexis Johnson, and I'm a second-year doctoral student in the Social Foundations of Education program at the University of Virginia School of Education. I also serve as a graduate research assistant with the Teachers in the Movement Project in the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. My research focuses on the history of African-American higher education, specifically predominantly Black institutions of higher education. And while I was not involved with this interview, I'm super excited to discuss it today because my other primary area of research is education during the civil rights and Black power movements.
Thank you. For today's webinar, we will discuss the genesis and challenges of our interview with Dr. Walker, as well as view and discuss 3 clips from the interview. So after viewing each clip, panelists will offer comments. We encourage the audience to please ask questions in the Q&A box if something piques your interest. We hope to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of our discussion. Before beginning our discussion on Dr. Walker, we first turn to discussing the guiding principles of our oral history research approach.
Thank you. So while Teachers in the Movement is an oral history project, we don't conceive of oral history as merely a research methodology. We also recognize it as a traditional cultural practice in the African American community, whereby stories are told and histories are preserved. In the Black community, oral history is a cultural practice which traces its roots to slavery. First, the enslaved relied on the oral tradition, for they knew the dangers of the written word, of knowing that they could be punished or worse, killed if their literacy was revealed. Additionally, even the enslaved who were not yet literate according to American standards, and by this I mean that we must remember that the enslaved were a cultured people prior to the transatlantic slave trade, still recognized the dangers of the written word. Finally, the oral tradition was not only a means of protection, it also served as a path to freedom. Yet the roots and significance of oral history in the Black community trace even farther back than slavery. In this regard, the project illuminates the figure of the griot. In West Africa, the griot served as both a historian and a storyteller who preserved the histories and genealogies of his or her respective tribes and communities. Emphasizing the centrality of the griot to the preservation of Black histories, Alex Haley, author of Roots, the Saga of an American Family, wrote, "When a griot dies, it is as if a library has burned to the ground. The griot symbolizes how all human ancestry goes back to some place and some time when there was no writing. Then, the memories of the mouths of ancient elders was the only way that the early histories of mankind got passed along for all of us today to know who we are." The Teachers in the Movement Project similarly recognizes and understands that when an elder dies, it is as a library with the vast knowledge that it houses has burned to the ground. It is under this recognition that we turn to our elders, the teachers in the movement, to attain and learn from the wealth of knowledge they possess while we are still fortunate to have them with us. The risks are too great and the loss is too substantial if we fail to preserve our elders' stories. In this regard, we also recall the Sankofa, a fictional bird from the Akan tribe in Ghana. The Sankofa represents going back to the past and bringing forth that which is useful. In conducting oral history interviews with the teachers of the civil rights movement, we hope to use their stories and lived experiences to influence contemporary educational policy and practice for equity and justice. It is our hope that these concepts, oral history as Black cultural practice, the griot, and the Sankofa will come to life today as we examine the life of Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Aldridge and Alexis, for those introductory remarks. We're going to now move into the section of our discussion where we engage several clips from the interview with Dr. Walker with our panelists. But before we view those clips, I want to begin by asking the panel about the genesis of this interview. How did it come about? How did you all locate Dr. Walker and secure the interview? So panelists, feel free to jump in and get us started with that.
So I'll take the first stab at this one. This was one of those moments as an oral historian where you just say, thank goodness I'm always running my mouth about this stuff. So in 2015, in spring of 2015, when we conducted this interview, I was a graduate student. I was in my second year of doctoral study. And one of the things that I did, several times a week to keep myself sane during the stress of graduate school was to go salsa dancing. And I spent a lot of time in Richmond dancing, getting my exercise, doing my socializing, and running my mouth about research, about this project that we were doing, interviewing teachers across the South. But at that point, we really were focusing on Virginia. And so at salsa one night, I was talking about teachers in the movement to a friend who actually grew up in the same community that I did in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, a man by the name of Kevin Goodwin. And so when I was telling Kevin about my research, about how we were interviewing teachers and activist educators who were active during the civil rights movement, he insisted that he had someone that we would love to talk to, and said, I can introduce you to Dr. Wyatt Tee Walker. He had actually been a pastor in Dinwiddie County during the 1950s, while he was also pastoring at Gillfield Baptist Church up the street in Petersburg. So of course we could not pass that up. My friend Kevin gave me contact information for Dr. Walker's wife, Teresa Ann Walker. And when I called her and explained who I was, what Teachers in the Movement is, she was very gracious. She ran it by her husband and they agreed. And I did not know it, but he had been living in a nursing home in Chester, Virginia, just north of Petersburg, for several years. She was very protective of his location because, as she put it to me, there's still some old racists out there, and she was concerned about his safety. But she was generous enough, they were generous enough to let us in. And from there, we did our typical process, sending out letters and the administrative tasks that we do. But yeah, it started from a conversation at salsa with a friend I'll always be grateful to for such an incredible introduction.
Let me jump in and just say that, securing interviews is not a scientific thing, has not been a scientific thing for our project. It's really word of mouth. It's an organic process, us bumping into people as Lindsay did, having conversations and just being out there with the people. It's a grassroots endeavor. When Lindsay told me that she had secured this interview, I called our videographer and asked him to ask him if he could go with 2 days notice down to Chester, Virginia and do the interview. and he said he didn't know, and then the next day he was not able to go. So therefore, we weren't going to miss that interview, and you don't get but one chance like that with someone of the stature of Dr. Walker. So we loaded up our camera. I barely knew how to turn it on, but we were going to get that interview. I just knew there's one rule of thumb that with videotaping oral histories, and that is, if the video doesn't come out great, make sure that the audio is good. And that's what our videographer told us to do. So we had the audio right on the camera, but we also had backup audio on our cell phones to make sure we got the interview. And so that was one of the kind of technical challenges that we had, kind of doing it at the last moment, but we weren't going to miss that opportunity.
Great. Anyone else like to weigh in on that question?
Oh, just a brief comment. I was so proud of Lindsay for scoring that coup with having an interview with Dr. Walker. I could not wait to find some way to participate, even if I was going to be on the wall. Yeah. And whatever I could do to help out Professor Aldridge with the lighting or anything, like, I just wanted to be there, because given his age, I know that there were going to be fewer and fewer opportunities to sit with someone that was truly a master of his craft and someone who was so significant to the movement. And to be able to be in his presence for me was an awesome experience.
Great, great. And yeah, thank you, Lindsay.
To follow up on that, Carmen, I was wondering if you all would like to just talk about more about the experience, like the emotional experience of interviewing a civil rights icon, someone that's literally living Black history.
Sure, sure. When I found out that Lindsay had scored an opportunity for an interview, I was excited because I had heard about Wyatt Tee Walker from my father and his brothers, my uncles. They all went to Virginia Union. And my cousin, Miles Fisher, was a classmate of Walker's at Virginia Union. And he knew both Wyatt and his wife. They called her Ann, even though her first name is Teresa. So they all knew each other. But as a youngster, while I would hear these names, to actually begin to put a connection between, this is who they've been talking about. So it wasn't just seeing his name in terms of printed materials or books, but to actually see him made a 360 connection for me that I think has really helped me as a historian.
Sure.
For me, I was just kind of blown away by the generosity of someone of his stature sharing time with us, and Anne's generosity, knowing how protective she was of him, them deciding that this was a good use of his time, which was precious, and his energy, which was precious. One memory that I have of the interview, and this was before the cameras were even rolling. I believe folks were kind of setting up, and I was, talking with him to warm him up. He had a tattoo. It was somewhere visible, like on his arm or on his hand, but this Adinkra symbol, Alexis talking about Adinkra. And I can never remember how the symbol is pronounced. It's the one that starts with like a GY. But I asked him, like, what does this symbol mean? And he said, it means I fear no man but God. And I was just kind of blown away, like, yeah, this is a person who is in our history books because he took this active, fearless approach to living his faith and being, one of these pastor intellectuals out of the tradition of King and of their mentors at Morehouse. Like to see that tradition, that intellectual tradition, that clerical tradition represented by the person in front of me, it was a really awe-inspiring moment.
Yeah, I think this is a good opportunity to discuss how we as oral historians can run into some challenges in the field. And we've hit on a few. Dr. Foster, you mentioned age, and Dr. Jones, you mentioned being ready to take an interview at the drop of any moment. Can anyone just discuss some of the challenges in conducting this interview or any interviews as oral historians?
One thing I'll share is that sometimes when you get to the place where the interview will happen, it may not be you may not have the right lighting, you may not have the right setting. And I remember for us, we just had to ask permission to just move things around, everything from the lamp lighting to the chairs to everything, so that it would go well with the camera shots that we wanted and we wouldn't have background distractions. So just being polite, but bold enough to say, look, we've got to move this around, particularly when you're moving the place and space where somebody is actually physically comfortable at. I think that was an interesting challenge for us. Wouldn't you say, Professor Aldridge?
Yes, that was definitely a challenge in this situation. I remember in particular us being concerned about the color of the wall being of orange color. And we were trying to figure out how it was going to look on camera. And we just said, look, let's just get the interview. Let's not worry about that. Another challenge that we often have, can be a good challenge, but it's a challenge nonetheless sometimes, is that these individuals will bring materials to the interview. And Lindsay, you may remember that before we went down to the space where we did the interview, we were actually in Dr. Walker's room. And he was showing us, Carmen, you may remember this too, he was showing us his books, his writings, he had documents, and we were trying our best to listen to him, take pictures of his documents, and also prepare for going down to the other room to do the interview. And it took 4 of us, because I think we had it was the 3 of us, and we had, who's the Reverend from First Baptist Church?
Oh yes, Hodari Hamilton.
Hodari Hamilton.
He was there with us, yeah.
Yeah, he joined us as well. So it took all 4 of us, and it shouldn't surprise you, because Dr. Walker is that kind of person. He has a lot of energy. He was ready to talk, and so it was exciting. But those are the kind of challenges we face.
Yeah, the one other thing that I remember is just the fact that he was such an enthusiastic interviewee. He, was chomping at the bit to talk to us. But at the same time, he's one of the, his was one of the interviews that I participated in with kind of, where the participant is like kind of frail. And we wanted to talk, he wanted to talk. And Anne was very like, let's conserve energy. If she had allowed us to kind of go beyond, I'm sure we could have been there all afternoon. But trying to narrow down when you have someone who has that much to say and that much to talk about could be a real challenge.
Yeah.
Lindsay, I agree with that. I'm also thinking that having that experience helped me to really consider what it means to pace yourself and to pace the person you're interviewing when you want to get so much from them, but they are older. Yeah. And they can be more frail, and you want to make sure that they are comfortable enough so that they don't get winded after a while. So it was so exciting to be able to ask him more questions. It was, for me, I know the experience was I wanted to hold on to his every word, and yet and still as an interviewer, it's like, all right, so what are my next set of questions from that? So trying to go back and forth, being enthralled, and then trying to also pace myself as an interviewer, I think was an interesting challenge for me.
For sure.
All right, thank you all so much for those comments. I think this is such a perfect time to turn to the clips so we can actually see some of what you all are talking about. So in this very first clip, Dr. Walker discusses the role of education in the civil rights movement, as well as his own work with education reform during the movement.
One of the aims of our project
is to better understand the multifaceted ways in which education was connected with the African American struggle for civil rights. And your own work demonstrates this a lot.
Well, Dr. King surrounded himself with very educated persons, and that made education a key to what we were doing.
And I think back on your own work around both creating equal access to education for Black children, and then also creating curriculum that speaks more accurately to the Black experience.
Exactly.
I wonder if you could talk some about the prayer pilgrimage for public schools in Virginia.
If you recall, Virginia embarked on a role of massive resistance, and that march was aimed at opening schools that were closed in Prince Edward County. That was my first major march, and we went to the state capitol in Virginia, here in Richmond, and we were under submachine guns, but we went anyway.
And the march was done twice?
No, only once that I remember. The reason I remember it, because the same day, Fidel Castro and his legions came out of the hills in Cuba and overthrew the Batista, and that's why they made the first page of the New York Times and we didn't.
Wow. What do you think the impact of that protest was? I'm sorry, what do you think the impact was of that protest in Virginia?
It was a demonstration, and the Black community was not going to roll over before segregationists who closed the schools, because the Prince Edward fight was a fight for open schools and better education.
I wondered if you could speak some about the Negro Heritage Library and your work to.
Well, as you know, I became president at one time, and I traveled the country, north, south, east, and west, trying to get schools to change their curriculum and include the correct and factual history of how Black people had helped build this country. And that was even more difficult in the civil rights movement.
Why was that?
Because the resistance of white education, white educators.
In that work, were you presenting the curricula to school superintendents, or were you more looking at the level of teachers?
Both. I dealt with superintendents of schools and teachers themselves, but it was a hard fight. We have more.
Right. What a remarkable clip to start out with, I believe. There's a couple of things that are pretty compelling to me about this clip, and I love to get the panelists' feedback on this, but I just think first, so we have someone who's not an educator in the traditional sense, but he's discussing the centrality of education in the movement, which to me just highlights how civil rights issues really were interconnected with each other. They weren't just like in these silos, like education over here, desegregation of public facilities here, just really all integrated. And I think too, we just see a more intimate or quiet form of activism that's happening, particularly in the immediate aftermath of the Brown decision. So we don't see, of course, the march was more of a public form of activism, but like his work around the curriculum and, meeting with the superintendents and the teachers, I just think that's fascinating to see just the scale and the range of activism that took place during this time period. So I wonder if the panelists might want to address that or anything else about this clip.
I can chime in here. When I hear that clip and think about Dr. Walker's activism around massive resistance in the state of Virginia, the state's refusal to integrate public schools and their insistence that they would rather shut down public schools than integrate. I think that that is really congruent with his broader role in the Black community at that time, as a, particularly as a pastor. So I really see him in the tradition with King, of course, and with folks like Benjamin Elijah Mays, these clerics who are trained that their responsibility to the Black community is also about intellectual training and not just the saving of souls. And so that's whether it's in the college classroom or whether that's advocating for policy changes that'll benefit Black kids on the K through 12 level. So that, you know, the responsibility for the cultivating of Black minds is as much part of their purview as is the cultivating of spiritual health. I see that, you know, in his simultaneous like pastoring of these churches in Virginia, while he's also leading the community in fighting back against the stripping of educational rights.
One of the things that I'm always fascinated about is how to triangulate sources, as particularly when I listened to that interview. And I know that he had felt like the Batista overthrow when Fidel Castro took over power in 1959 was really kind of taking the headlines away from what they were doing. But I went to the Richmond Times-Dispatch and looked to see very definitely he is on the front page of the paper. And it's just that it's in the corner on the bottom on the left-hand side where it says that 1,000 Negroes walk in the rain to protest school closings. So while he can feel like he didn't get headlines, he sure did. And I'll also say as a secondary part of that, on January 19th of 1959, which just happens to be Robert E. Lee's birthday, that happened to be the day that the federal courts did 2 smackdown rulings to really put a death knell to massive resistance. So from the January 1st march to what happened in the federal court in 1959 as they were protesting the way that the Prince Edward Black students were treated with the school closings and other schools as well. I think that, you know, his role in leading that march was extremely significant and powerful. And in fact, there was a second march on January 1st, 1960, because Martin Luther King did that march in 1960, which really was the precursor to the whole sit-in movement from not just Greensboro, but also Richmond, and to the desegregation of Richmond schools in September of 1960. His activism is amazing.
That's great. That's really great. So let's segue right into our second clip, where Dr. Walker discusses the role of historically Black colleges and universities in developing intellectual activists, as well as the teaching methods of his professors at Virginia Union University. So let's take a listen.
When you're a student at Virginia Union, could you talk some about how Virginia Union influenced you in terms of your intellectual development, your social development? And the reason I ask you that is because Virginia Union is well known for producing activist intellectuals like yourself. So I wanted you to talk some about that experience.
Well, I was taught by great teachers, Samuel Proctor, John Ellison, and Dr. John Moore. And however we thought about the social arrangement in America, they helped to radicalize us about it. And it was at Virginia Union that I first realized that the most effective person in Black life could be the clergy, because that's where most of us are, you know, in the Black religious life.
So you mentioned several well-known theologians and scholars. And could you talk some about what their pedagogy was like in the classroom? How did they teach? How did they get their messages across to students?
Well, Sam Proctor particularly he used a good bit of humor. That was one of his teaching methods, but they were also very well prepared in their disciplines of, for instance, New Testament and New Testament Greek was Sam Proctor's bailiwick, and John Moore was a Mississippian who taught German. But it was the Black church enterprise which undergirded all that we did at Virginia.
So we see here some themes that are pretty common throughout our teacher in the movement interviews, and those are intellectual activism and teaching pedagogy. So I wonder if one of the panelists can speak to those themes that are illuminated here.
Oh, let me talk about Virginia Union, since that's right in my backyard in Richmond. You know, Virginia Union's beginning started in 1865 in a place called Lumpkin's Jail, which was a former slave pen to teach freed slaves. And it was connected to the American Baptist Home Mission Society. And at the time as Virginia Union began to grow into itself, it was clearly an intellectual hub on the par with Howard, Fisk, and Atlanta University. There were key faculty and scholars at the time Walker was a student. He mentioned Dr. John Malchus Ellison, who happened to be the first Black university president and graduate of VUU. And then he talked about Samuel DeWitt Proctor, who was not only a student of Virginia Union, but became the dean of the theology school. And I'm sure that his influence as the theology school dean was very, very significant for Walker and many others as activist theologians. You know, Samuel DeWitt Proctor wound up leaving Virginia Union in 1960, and then he went to become president at North Carolina A&T. He was a real powerhouse, and his spirit, his passion still hovers not only over Virginia Union, but also with a Proctor conference that's held every year for activist theologians, students, and people that are also pastors. They had over 1,000 people to meet this past spring. Also, I might want to mention that Gordon Blaine Hancock had a master's in sociology from Harvard in 1921, and he was the chair of Union's Department of Economics and Sociology. And he stressed then how to link education to activism and required students to perform community service. So he was a leading spokesperson on campus and around Richmond for Black equality, pushing for Black self-determination and the concept of double duty dollar, which means keeping our money in our community. So you can just imagine what it was like for Walker to be in those kinds of times around so many Black intellectuals, activist scholars that, you see, I get excited, I'm sorry. But I can't help but talk about that because it means a lot to Virginia Union's history, its past, what it means to all of us as HBCU supporters, and he's just an exemplar. I do want to say one more thing real quickly, that Sam Proctor was really like in his 30s when he became a dean and then later president. So what that means is somebody that's like an older millennial Gen Xer, you know, that has a lot of power there. I mean, he was destined. So to be groomed by Sam Proctor and others, I think says a lot for young scholars that ask themselves, what am I doing and where am I going? You can go far, you're getting started early, and you can see you're standing on the shoulders of giants.
That's good. Anyone else like to weigh in here?
I'd just like to say that I couldn't wait to ask him that question. And that was a question regarding the influence that Virginia Union had on him, mainly because in many of our interviews of educators, particularly those in Virginia, they always talk to us about the influence that Virginia Union had on their intellectual development. In a few of our interviews, I remember people saying that Virginia Union was their Morehouse. It was Virginia's Morehouse, or Virginia's Spelman. And the educators that we've interviewed there have often talked to us about just the cast of characters that you might find on Virginia Union's campus on any given day. Carolyn Mosby, someone who is an educator in Virginia, lives in Richmond, that Carmen introduced us to and we interviewed. She talked about just, you know, being on campus and running into Dr. King. That was a common thing. So it just gives you a sense of what kind of place that was. And it was a place that developed civil rights activists, you know? So I was really glad to get that part of the interview.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll move to our final clip for today's installment, where Dr. Walker discusses his interaction with activist Malcolm X.
I want to tell you a hilarious story. When we were in college, when I was in college in the 80s, we used to watch this clip of you on television doing an interview. I think it was with Malcolm X. We talked about this earlier. Yeah. And back then, what we found fascinating is that they allowed you guys to smoke cigarettes on. Yeah. We're like, this guy's cool. We remember that. You remember that well enough. And you were going toe to toe. I mean, you and Malcolm seem to have a lot in common, and I found that fascinating. I said, so this guy's
we almost came to blows.
Really?
And I had noticed that he had a very prominent Adam's apple, and I made my mind that if we came to blows, I would attack him at the time I ever first.
Oh, man.
But I wasn't intimidated by him at all.
You were not. You were not. You're not.
And he wasn't used to anybody talking back to him like I did.
How about James Baldwin? Do you remember him well?
I remember him, yeah. A very skillful writer, and he attacked some very grave issues about America, and I think that's what I admired about him.
Okay, I love this clip because I think it really highlights the value and significance of oral history, because we get to hear in real time stories about these great historical figures that we often read about, right? Like Malcolm X. So panelists, I'd love to hear your feedback or comments on this very lively clip. And maybe Dr. Aldridge, you can start by providing us some context for where we are in this part of the interview.
Okay, sure. Actually, the interview was over. And we left the video camera running and the audio running. And this actually occurred after we'd stopped the interview. And I forgot to ask him about that, about his conversation, his debate, so to speak, with Malcolm X. And so I just asked him and we just kept it rolling. So sometimes that happens. You get some of your best information after it's over. So luckily we had the camera on. But I was, you know, talking about in the 1980s is when I first saw this show that aired actually in June of 1963, and it was a show called The Open Mind. And on that show, you had Malcolm, Wyatt Tee Walker, James Farmer, and Alan Morrison discussing the civil rights movement and the strategies of the movement. And, you know, it was just a funny thing for me to see individuals sitting on there on the show, smoking cigarettes and mixing it up, debating strategies of the movement. And at the time, Walker, I think, was around 35 years old and Malcolm was 38. So you saw these two very young, vibrant activists and scholars, you know, talking about the differences between, you know, using violence as necessary. And of course, Wyatt Tee Walker talking about nonviolent passive resistance. So I admire both Malcolm and Walker, and to see them mix it up was just fascinating. I would never have known that I would have had an opportunity back then in the 80s to ask Dr. Walker about this. But let me be clear, it was very clear to me that they had mutual respect for one another and that both were intellectually precise and vibrant. And I'll circle back around, but that was my recollection of it.
Great. Anyone else before we move on?
Let me just add one thing. You said this earlier, Danielle. You know, a great aspect of oral history is that a story like that, you won't find in a document. You won't find in the archive. And so when we have opportunities to interview people, we ask them, activists, educators, what have you, we ask them what was going on around them, what was swirling on around them. We asked them, did you have interactions with other civil rights activists? Did you know this person? And to your surprise, and to our surprise, well, not to our surprise now, because this is why we asked them this question, and that is that they will often say, yeah, I remember I had lunch with Oliver Hill. And you will say, all right, tell us more about that. All right. And so that can lead us to a whole set of different questions and take us on in different directions that we hadn't intentionally, intended to go. So that's the great part about intellectual history. It gives, it gives life to it gives life to history, and allows us to put them in our interviewees in conversation with history itself.
Absolutely.
So Dr. Ulrich, to follow up on that, and as we move towards concluding the discussion component of our webinar, I wonder if you wanted to just expound upon what you all learned, and of course the other panelists, please join in, what you all learned from the interview in terms of the civil rights movement and just the methodological approach, really something I was referring to earlier when talking about how we conceptualize our study, like living Black history, the concept of the griot and the Sankofa. Do y'all want to provide some commentary on that point?
Let me just start by saying that, and I'm not going to talk long because I want to hear the other panelists. And that is that we see our process as organic. Of course, we go in with a set of questions, but we understand that there is no such thing as a scientific interview. That interviews are organic, they take a life of their own, and interviews take a life on their own depending on who conducts the interview. And so we remain cognizant to that when we interview individuals, and we see it. We definitely have an approach. We have processes that we must go through, but we also see our approach is also a form of art.
One of the things I can think about as we concluded the interview was what else is in the room that we need to be recognizing rather than just Dr. Walker. And clearly it wasn't a what, it was a who. It was his wife. And I am proud to be a womanist in my work. And I kept asking myself, where is her story? What is it that she could share with us? Because he did not do what he did all by himself. He had to have a woman not behind him, but beside him and leading the charge with him. And I think it's important to know, and there was a Washington Post article that even showed the two of them together during the Freedom Rides. Teresa Ann Walker is a legend all in her own. To me, she's more of like the hidden figure within this story. And I think the hidden figures of Black women during the civil rights movement is so important to think about. When we ask questions about pedagogy and education, I did not realize until later that her children were barred from the Petersburg schools because of his activism. So those children were homeschooled. They did not have a child's life because their parents, much like Martin Luther King's children, their parents were in and out of jail all the time. And they were taken care of by several different relatives and close family friends. So I was grateful that in October, I had an opportunity with the Chesterfield Library to moderate a panel with her, as well as being joined by Dr. Cory Booker, Elvatrice Belches, and Joel Howard. So we could learn more about women in the civil rights movement in Chesterfield County in particular. I feel that her story has a lot of merit because as a womanist, I know that he could do what he could do because of her. And that story also is one that needs to be shared and told.
Okay, thank you, panelists. Does anyone have any concluding comments that you would like to make about the interview with Dr. Walker before we move to our Q&A segment?
I'll conclude by just saying how much pride this interview inspired in me. You know, like I said, I'm from Dinwiddie County, where Reverend Dr. Walker pastored a church for a few years. I went to high school and attended church down the street from Gilfield Baptist Church. And you just have been in Southside Virginia for a long time. And to realize that I could look around and see a place not just kind of marked by the challenges that came with deindustrialization. You know, Petersburg and Southside Virginia in general suffered, you know, economically because of that, but that there's rich resources in terms of history. There's rich resources in terms of a legacy of resistance to white supremacy. There are rich resources in terms of figures, not only like Walker, but like the NAACP members who marched with him. All of those folks whose children like his were being excluded from an equal education. It just made me really proud to be from Southside Virginia. And to be part of a research team that takes seriously and examines really closely what it was that folks did down the street from my parents to contribute to a movement that changed the fabric of our country. Yeah, so that was the main kind of thing that I took away from it and still take away from the interview.
Well, thank you. I am certainly reinvigorated to do the work and do oral history after this discussion. So we are going to now begin our Q&A segment because I see there are questions that are waiting to be answered. So Leslie will help us facilitate this portion of our presentation.
Thank you for submitting your questions. So we have a variety of questions. To get us started, some people were asking about the interview process. So I'm hoping the panelists can share, did interviewing Reverend Walker lead to other activists being interviewed?
It could have, but I slipped. Dr. Walker told me that he would make an introduction to Dorothy Cotton. I waited and I waited and I didn't get around to it. I learned a valuable lesson. And if I want to say, she passed away, right? And so the lesson learned is that when you interview someone of this stature, they can connect you with people that you otherwise would have a very difficult time just calling on the phone, sending a letter or email. And I regret that I did not follow up on that interview, but he did, and I didn't even ask him. He said, "I have someone else I think you should interview when you get a chance." And so it could have, but it didn't. So for those of you who are doing oral history, whenever you interview someone like Dr. Walker, or anyone for that matter, and they have a suggestion for someone for you to interview, follow up very quickly.
When securing interviews organically, how is this accepted in research journals?
Well, I guess it depends on what research journal you're submitting to. I mean, you have to, of course, adhere to some of the guidelines to that particular journal, but you know, what we do is we just talk about our interviews, right? We just say, look, we used a snowball effect, kind of a snowball methodology, so to speak. In other words, we talked to people who suggested other people that we should talk to. We have not seen this as a problem so far, as a challenge, but I suspect there are some journals that may be outside of the history field, more social science journals that might want a more explicit type of methodological explanation as to how you secured your interviews, but we haven't had that as an issue so far. We may in the future, though. Anyone else can please feel free to respond.
I think.
Professor, oh, go ahead, Lindsay.
Oh, okay. So I think the thing to think about for whoever asked that question is that this is not like a qualitative research project where the goal is to use a set of very strict methodologies to create a research sample that's like broadly representative. With the snowball style of sampling that Dr. Ulrich talks about, and with the organic, us running into people, I think what matters is the kinds of claims that the team makes from that. And so it would be one thing to take this interview data and say, according to our data from this snowball sample and from this kind of organic method of sampling, we have found that teachers in the South between the 1950s and the 1970s broadly and generally thought this way. But what Teachers in the Movement is trying to do, and I think does better than any research project out there, is looking at the particularities. So Southside Virginia in the 1950s and 60s is a very particular place. Danville in the 60s is a very particular place. Richmond in the 60s is a very particular place. And so I think what the project is trying to do is to provide a set of narratives that add flesh to this narrative around education during the civil rights movement, not to be like the sole source of information, but we can take some of those other sources of historical knowledge, those papers, those letters, those reports, et cetera, that demographic data, and layer this stuff on top of it and say, we know generally kind of what a story is about a desegregating community. And let's look further and see, what did teachers actually in Lynchburg experience as their communities were transitioning from segregated to integrated schooling. And so I think it's a matter of what kind of claims you make from the data that's gonna either draw questions from a journal or allow them to say, okay, this passes muster.
Thank you. So as a former history teacher, I'm very aware of the importance of oral history plays in preserving African-American traditions. I wondered how any of you felt about bringing oral history techniques and projects into the public schools. I see it as a way for African-American youth to connect with their past. What do you think? Is there a national oral history curriculum out there that you know of?
So I'll respond to this. This is, I am on the African American History Commission for the Commonwealth of Virginia. And this is something that we are in conversation with at this very moment about the use of oral history as a means or teaching tool to teach African American history. We have a summer institute each summer for teachers, in which we introduce them to some of the materials in the Teachers in the Movement project, but we also give them some instruction in teaching in oral history and teaching oral history in the curriculum. So that's something that our project intends to continue to pursue, and we hope to at some point develop a curriculum around teaching oral history in African American communities.
So in this vein too, have you considered using information from your oral histories to develop a curriculum that could be used not only in traditional schools or learning environments, but also in those institutions where people are incarcerated?
I think I'll let my other panelists respond to that.
Well, I will say that I can't really speak to where the curriculum is being used, but I know that based on these oral history interviews, actually Danielle, you probably would be the person, but
Yes.
but yeah, there is curriculum coming out of Teachers in the Movement to talk more about the role of educators.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we are working on that. That is forthcoming. There's lots that the center is doing to gather up all of these teaching pedagogical tools and put them together for use. So that is definitely on the right.
So we haven't explicitly, sought to do that, but it's certainly something that we can foresee ourselves doing. I mean, the curriculum that we're developing just in general on teaching oral histories of African-American communities could be used in a variety of different spaces. So whoever asks that question, I hope will respond to me directly, and we can have a conversation about, how we can collaborate.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of teachers that have asked questions about sites you'd suggest for teachers to get primary sources in Virginia. As one example, another person asked a question as a first-year history teacher. Their students have really gotten into final projects this year where they are creating their own podcast on desegregation and massive resistance in Virginia. Many students are extremely interested in getting interviews or firsthand or secondhand accounts or oral histories within their projects. As a teacher, they're not sure where to start or how to help them. Do you have any advice, recommendations, or sources you would recommend?
Yes. The first place that I would suggest they start is with their parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, aunties, great-aunties, great-great-aunties, uncles, et cetera, right? So that's the way that I teach I teach oral history in my classroom, is I say, look, talk to your parents. Well, it's to the point now where I'm all enough where they're talking to their grandparents, okay? And I'm saying your parents, they lived during this period. Your grandparents lived during this period. So reach out to them and interview them, and they may have other people that you can interview. And it happens all the time. Every time I teach my civil rights and education course at UVA, I have probably half of my class will decide to study desegregation of the high school in their local community. They'll go home, call their parents, tell them what they're interested in doing, and their parents say, you should talk to your grandparents. And then it just snowballs from there, and they end up, and we've produced some, these students have produced some great projects from this activity. So I would encourage you to start there. And from there, it's just kind of snowball. In terms of other primary sources, we're at a point now where you can find many newspapers online. I mean, without even having to, go and look on microfiche. Now you can get online, you can find newspapers, you can find school yearbooks online. So there's a lot that you can do online in terms of primary sources. So I would start with those places: newspapers, interviews of grandparents, parents, etc., and school yearbooks. Those are good places to start.
Now, also, Professor Aldridge, the Teachers in the Movement website be a really good resource. Am I right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think right now we have about 52 interviews up. By the end of, by mid-July, we'll probably have 100 up. But our goal is to conduct 500 videotape interviews. And we're in the process of now restructuring our website where we're going to put up primary sources too. So when we interview people, we actually take pictures of their materials and things like that. So our site will be, evolving and will become more robust within the next, 6 to 12 months. So that's a place to go as well.
Definitely. There's also a project that was started by Old Dominion University called Desegregation of Virginia Education. It's called the Dove Project. You can look at their website and you can get information there. They also have a Facebook page, and they look at Virginia broadly. So it is another resource that folks can use to learn more about school desegregation. And what I find fascinating about it is that there are also rural County connections that come out from that site as well. Because I think that it's easy to think about larger urban areas like Richmond and Norfolk, but also to begin to ask yourself what happened in like Buckingham, Cumberland, Pulaski County. That's really also very interesting. And like Professor Aldridge said, it's a matter of how do you use the network village to find out what's going on. That connects with what Alexa said earlier about the role of the griot. So how to really recognize that it takes a village to do oral history.
Thank you. So in this vein, another question was brought up. In one of the interview clips, Dr. Walker said talking with schools and superintendents and encouraging them to include Black educational history in their curricula was harder than the civil rights movement itself. What parallels do you see with that challenge and the challenges of representation in education today? How do you think the particular challenge should influence how we move forward today as educators?
So I can tell you what we've done. Every summer we host, when we host our teacher summer, a summer workshop with teachers, we bring in the teachers from the 50s and 60s to our workshop, and they engage in a conversation around issues of race, diversity, etc. And we record it, right? And so I think one of the most important things we can do as an oral history project is to create opportunities for dialogue between these, teachers of yesterday and teachers of today. Another thing that we are in the process of doing is creating a podcast where we actually have conversations with teachers from various generations. So I think, just the dialogue is a good first place to start. And my colleagues may want to jump in. You may have some other ideas as well.
Okay.
Let's go on to the next question.
Yeah. So next question, it's obvious that Dr. Walker was beyond fearless. What, in your opinion, of the interviewers and in the context of Dr. Walker's approach, did the nonviolent resistance look like?
I think the nonviolence resistance in the case of Dr. Walker was just him exercising his rights, just exercising the right to protest, attempting to exercise the right to check out a book or to enroll his kids in a school, or encourage other people to use their rights as well. Clearly he was fierce, but he was fierce in pursuit of those things that he knew were his due as an American citizen and as a Virginian. That to me is how I see it. And also, I'm sorry, we mentioned a few times in the interview clip, and also Dr. Foster mentioned the prayer pilgrimage. Part of nonviolent resistance, this was a clergyman, he was to draw upon his faith, draw upon the practice of prayer and in the language of prayer in his protest, to kind of call out the hypocrisy of a Christian state denying rights to African Americans.
I think of the fact that there are what I will label as like 3 C's: courage, commitment, and a sense of consciousness. Part of what it takes to be an activist or a leader. I think one challenge is that while it sounds all exciting in hindsight, as we think about Dr. Walker, that is hard. It is hard to be a leader. It takes a lot of courage, because even though that pilgrimage walk from the mosque auditorium, which is now the Altria Theater, which is at Monroe Park near VCU, to go all the way to the state capitol. You heard there were machine guns that were there. That he said in his interview, it takes a lot of courage. And courage is a part of leading. And it is not easy. It is hard and it's difficult. And I think it's important for young folks to understand that's where the commitment comes in. And you really have to be very conscious and conscientious about when and where you enter into the fray to stand up and be counted. This is not just 1950s, 1960s. We're also talking about what that means in terms of the power of now.
So another question that was asked, what are the major upcoming scholarly products planned for this project? I thoroughly enjoyed reading your History of Education Society presidential address featuring teachers in the movement that Professor Aldridge did.
So yes, this project is funded by the Spencer Foundation. It's a 5-year project, and we, of course, what comes along with that is publication. So the first major publication to come out of the project was my presidential address, which is in the latest issue of the History of Education, the History of Ed Quarterly. And that will be followed up by a review of education research piece that I am working on now with some colleagues and teachers in the movement. We plan to send that out within the next 2 weeks. And we're in the process. This webinar has helped me a lot because people want to know, how do you do oral history, right? And so I was just on a phone conversation just yesterday with the publisher about producing a short volume on our research methodology. And so those are some of the projects, and we hope to have a draft of that short methodological book by the end of next summer, and we're working on it now. It will be based on our research. It will be something similar to, I think, the book Remembering Jim Crow, but we're going to be a little bit more explicit about our methodology, mainly because we're historians of education. We're an education school, which often, there's a requirement to talk more about methodology. So those are our upcoming projects. And if anyone on this call has any suggestion for future projects, please don't hesitate to email me, because we're doing that too. Oh, by the way, and we're launching a podcast in about 2 weeks that will be on the UVA website. And the first podcast will be on Johnny Fullerwinder, who was a teacher in Danville, Virginia. And the second podcast is going to be on a good friend of mine named James Wright in Columbia, South Carolina. He doesn't know that he's going to be on the second one, but he's going to be the second podcast. So we have quite a few activities taking place right now.
So Dr. Aldridge, you mentioned some methodology. We have another question. How does or will the pandemic change your methodology as you seek to conduct additional interviews?
I would like to turn this question over to our graduate research assistant with the Teachers in the Movement Project, who has helped shape our thinking approach around this issue. Alexis.
Thank you. I think, as Dr. Aldridge mentioned at the beginning, this webinar series was born in response to the pandemic, because we wanted to continue to do the work that we're doing without letting this awful crisis deter us as much as it could. And I just think that it's really an interesting time that this pandemic is going on, particularly around research. because in our field, in history of education, and I would say just historical studies in general, there's been a huge move towards digital humanities and digital history. And so I really think that this, and as evidenced through this webinar and the podcast and everything that we're working on, this really does offer us, though it's an unfortunate time, a great time to move into that arena and realm of doing digital oral history. So obviously, logistically, that's going to present some challenges, but I think it's one that, you know, again, just this webinar being evidence that we're equipped to handle. And again, just even without the pandemic going on, this is just kind of the new wave of doing things in digital history and digital humanities. So, you know, when we emerge out of this crisis, the world will be a different place, but we can at least say that we will have gained these valuable tools to be able, and another thing, I just think that going digital, again, even sans the pandemic, it's a way to reach more and more people. So we can share these wonderful stories of these teachers and educators and activists that were participants in the movement and activists in the movement, in a way that if we did not have digital tools, that we wouldn't have been able to do before.
Yeah. Let me just thanks, Alexis. Let me just add something, add to this. And Danielle, you can jump in too, because you've been working with me closely on this. We're getting ready to do 35 interviews via Zoom and the telephone.
That's right.
In Charlotte, North Carolina, right? We're proceeding with doing Zoom interviews in Lynchburg. Now, I was resistant to this at first, but we don't know how long we're going to be in the situation that we're going to be in. And I didn't want us to get into December and say, we still can't interview people. And then we missed 6 or 7 months. So there's no putting this genie back in the bottle with this technology. So we're embracing it wholeheartedly. We're moving forward with it. And we're trying to conceptualize what that might look like. So instead of just connecting with individuals we want to interview, we want to make these interviews a family experience. So if we're using Zoom, they can have their grandbabies, their children, and everyone setting up the camera and everything for them. So instead of just making it kind of one-on-one thing, we're thinking about our interviews as a family experience. And that's what we have actually written in the letter. And we're getting some response to that. So again, that goes back to that griot tradition, that same Gopher tradition. We're not just doing research, we're doing spirit work. That's what we call it, spirit work.
Yeah. Now's the time. So on that note, definitely go to our website, and there's a contact us page if you want your families or your educators, your city's voice to be in the archival record. Definitely reach out to us, because we are working. We're still doing the work.
One more thing I got to respond to. Someone asked a question about how they could help if they are friends of the project or the center. That's a very important question. We're going to respond to that before we get, contact me, okay? And there are many ways. I mean, we need people to help us identify people that we can interview. That's what we need a lot of work on. We need people to help us possibly do some interviews. Sometimes we will ask someone to get training so that they can do the interview, because individuals may be comfortable with interviewing with people who are not necessarily on the team, but you still have to go through the training and whatnot. But so please reach out to the Teachers in the Movement Project, and we will respond to you and find ways that we can collaborate. So if there are no other questions, let me just say, this concludes our first Teachers in the Movement discussion in our webinar series. We'd like to extend our sincere thanks to everyone for joining us today. Please be sure to follow us on social media at Teachers in the Movement and use the hashtag TimWebinarSeries. Please also visit our website, www.teachersinthemovement.com, for more interviews. Be sure to be on the lookout for our next webinar in the series. We hope that you will join us again soon. Thank you.